Mr. Harding, a man for whom ink and paper constituted a more reliable reality than the fickle world of flesh and blood, read the letter for a second time. This was not his usual practice. His mind, honed by decades of parsing the driest of legal clauses, was a practiced engine of extraction. It took in information, sorted it by relevance, and filed it away with ruthless efficiency. To reread something for pleasure was an extravagance, a deviation from the tidy ledger of his life. Yet here he was. The letter was from a Miss Eleanor Vance, soon to be Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood. It was, on its surface, a simple inquiry regarding a minor clause in her marriage settlement, pertaining to the dowry of a widowed aunt. But it was the architecture of the sentences that held him. The prose was clean, elegant, and possessed of a startlingly dry wit. In discussing the disposition of a small holding, she had managed to subtly evoke the works of Virgil and comment on the follies of modern husbandry in a single, perfectly balanced, subordinate clause. It was a letter written by a person who thought, a person who saw the world in layers of meaning. He placed the letter on his desk, its crisp linen edge aligned perfectly with the corner of his blotter. He recalled, with a discomfort that felt like a poorly digested meal, his last conversation on this very topic with his employer, the Duke of Blackwood himself. The Duke, a man whose formidable presence could make prime ministers stammer, had waved a dismissive hand when Harding had attempted to convey the substance of Miss Vance's previous correspondence. "Is it settled, Harding?" the Duke had asked, his attention already drifting towards a map of his northern estates. "Very nearly, Your Grace. Miss Vance raises a most astute point regarding the riparian rights along the—" "Spare me the details," the Duke had cut in, his voice laced with the particular brand of weary impatience reserved for trivialities. "Her letters are not worth reading. Simply ensure the matter is concluded. Is that all?" The solicitor had felt the slight like a physical blow on Miss Vance's behalf. Not worth reading. He looked again at the elegant script, the precise choice of words. It was like declaring the sun not worth looking at. Mr. Harding, a man of contracts and consequences, made a small private entry in the great mental ledger he kept on the world. The Duke of Blackwood, for all his intelligence and power, was a fool. An oblivious, high-handed, magnificent fool. And he was about to marry a woman whose true worth he could not even begin to compute. The arrangement had been, from its inception, a masterpiece of social and financial pragmatism. Alistair, the 10th Duke of Blackwood, had reached the age of 32, having successfully dodged the matrimonial ambitions of every great house in England. He was not a romantic. He was a steward. His duty was to his name, his lands, his tenants, and the continuation of a line that stretched back to the Norman conquest. Duty now dictated he must produce an heir. The requirements for a duchess were, in his mind, simple and few. She must be of gentle birth, possessed of a placid temperament, unimpeachable virtue, and a constitution suited to childbearing. She must not be a gossip, a schemer, or, heaven forbid, a woman of strident opinions. He required a decorative and functional addition to his household, a quiet presence to manage the domestic sphere while he managed everything else. Miss Eleanor Vance had been presented as the perfect candidate. Her family, the Vances of Surrey, had an impeccable lineage, but a disastrously depleted fortune. Her father, a gentleman scholar more interested in ancient Greek pottery than modern accounting, had mortgaged their estate to the hilt. Eleanor, at 24, was considered past the first blush of youth, and her quiet, observant nature was easily mistaken for dullness in the clamorous ballrooms of London. She was pretty enough, in a subtle, understated way that would not draw undue attention. She was intelligent, her proposer had assured the Duke, but not in a manner that would prove tiresome. She was, in short, the perfect solution to his dynastic problem. For Eleanor, the proposal was a lifeline thrown to a drowning family. It was not a love match. She had never entertained such fanciful notions. Love was for the heroines of the novels she devoured in the quiet of her father's dusty library. Her life was a matter of practicalities. The Duke's proposal meant her father would not die in debtor's prison. It meant her younger sister could have a proper season. It meant the preservation of their ancestral home. She accepted the role of Duchess of Blackwood with the same sober sense of purpose with which she managed her family's dwindling household accounts. It was a position, a duty. She would perform it to the best of her ability. Her heart was not part of the bargain. It remained her own, a quiet, well-guarded territory. Her only true expression was in her letters. In them, she could be the person she was when no one was looking, witty, analytical, perceptive. Writing to Mr. Harding about the legal intricacies of the settlement, she allowed her mind its full range, assuming, naively, that a man of law would appreciate precision and clarity. She did not know that her letters were intended for an audience of one, a man who saw her only as a signature on a contract. Their first meeting after the betrothal was arranged was an exercise in stilted formality. It took place in the Vance's worn but dignified drawing room, the threadbare Aubusson carpet and faded silk curtains bearing silent witness to the family's decline. The Duke was impeccably dressed, impossibly tall, and carried with him an aura of such remote authority that it seemed to lower the temperature of the room. He was polite, his questions to her father concise, his compliments to her mother perfectly calibrated. He turned to Eleanor, his gray eyes assessing her as they might a promising filly. "I trust the arrangements meet with your approval, Miss Vance." "They are entirely satisfactory, Your Grace," she replied, her voice even and calm. She did not look at him directly, instead focusing on a point just past his shoulder. It was a technique she had perfected for dealing with intimidating figures, render them part of the landscape. He seemed to approve of her lack of maidenly flutterings. He preferred composure. "Good. Blackwood Manor is a substantial enterprise. I am sure you will find the duties of its mistress manageable." There was a faint, almost imperceptible condescension in his tone, the casual assumption that the running of one of the country's great houses was a simple matter of ordering flowers and approving menus. Eleanor, who had for years stretched a handful of shillings to feed a household of 10, felt a flicker of ironic amusement. She merely inclined her head. "I shall endeavor to do my duty, Your Grace." The conversation moved on to other things: the weather, London politics, the lamentable state of the roads in Surrey. Alistair found himself observing his future wife. She sat with a stillness that was absolute. It was not the fidgety stillness of a nervous girl, but the deep, settled quiet of someone entirely self-contained. He found it restful. She would not be a source of drama. He was satisfied. He had made a logical, sensible choice. A few weeks later, he visited again to finalize some detail with her father. As they concluded their business, the conversation turned to the Blackwood estates. Alistair mentioned a recurring problem with flooding on a series of tenant farms in the lower valley. "We have tried drainage ditches, reinforcing the banks. Nothing seems to work," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. The land becomes sour and useless every third spring. From her chair by the window, where she had been silently mending a piece of lace, Eleanor spoke. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, her voice soft but clear. "But have you considered water meadows?" Alistair turned, surprised she had even been listening. "Water meadows?" "Yes," she continued, her eyes now on her work, as if she were discussing the thread count of her lace. "The ancient practice of controlled winter flooding. It deposits silt, warming the soil and encouraging an early growth of grass. It would turn a liability into an asset, providing early fodder for livestock and enriching the land rather than souring it. There is an excellent chapter on the subject in Gervais Markham's A Way to Get Wealth." There was a moment of stunned silence. Her father looked at her with a mixture of pride and alarm. The Duke stared. He had expected a comment on the color of the draperies, not a detailed proposal on 17th-century agricultural techniques. "I see," he said slowly. He felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation, the distinct feeling of being recalibrated. He had categorized her as placid and decorative. This information did not fit. He examined it, then filed it away under anomaly. A bit of trivia she had picked up from a book, no doubt. A quaint country hobby. He dismissed it from his mind, but not entirely. A tiny, curious splinter remained lodged somewhere in his consciousness. The wedding was a grand but impersonal affair. Eleanor felt like a spectator at her own life. She stood beside the towering, remote figure of the Duke, made her vows, and became the Duchess of Blackwood. She moved into the cavernous grandeur of the manor, a place of intimidating beauty and history. The staff were respectful but distant, awaiting the measure of their new mistress. The Duke was the Duke. He was courteous, he was correct, and he was profoundly absent, even when seated across from her at the long, gleaming expanse of the dining table. She performed her duties with the quiet competence that was her hallmark. She met with the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose stern demeanor concealed a deep loyalty to the house. She reviewed the accounts, finding several areas of significant waste, which she corrected with quiet, diplomatic suggestions. She learned the names of the senior staff, their families, their small worries. The house began to run with a new, smoother efficiency. Alistair noticed the effects, if not the cause. His meals were better. His schedule was managed more seamlessly. The atmosphere in the house felt more settled. He credited this to his good fortune in having chosen a wife with a sensible, biddable nature. He was pleased with his bargain. Eleanor found her sanctuary in the vast, neglected library. It was a room that had been the domain of generations of Blackwood men, and it smelled of old leather, beeswax, and masculine indifference. She began to catalog the collection, discovering rare manuscripts and forgotten first editions. It was here that she felt most herself, a quiet scholar in a world of her own making. It was during one of these afternoons, several months into her marriage, that her carefully constructed peace was shattered. She was searching for a folio on architectural drawings of the estate, hoping to find plans for the old glass houses she dreamed of restoring. The Duke's steward had directed her to a series of filing cabinets in a small alcove off the main study. She found the folio she was looking for, but beside it was another, slimmer one, labeled simply, Vance Marriage Settlement. A flicker of curiosity, an emotion she rarely indulged, prompted her to open it. It contained copies of the contracts, the dry legal language that had defined her future. And tucked inside the back cover was a sheaf of correspondence between the Duke and his solicitor. Her eyes scanned the letters, mostly mundane confirmations of clauses and dates. Then she saw it. A letter from Mr. Harding to the Duke, dated from before the wedding. In it, the solicitor had, with his customary precision, quoted a full paragraph from one of her own letters to him, the very passage on riparian rights she had been so proud of. It was a clear, intelligent argument, well-reasoned and supported by evidence she had gleaned from her reading. And there, in the margin, was a note in her husband's sharp, impatient script. The ink was a slash of black against the cream paper. 5 brutal words. Harding, spare me the details. She read it again, and again. The words seemed to lift off the page and brand themselves onto her mind. She felt a cold, hollowing sensation, a quiet and complete devastation that was worse than any storm of anger. It was not the insult that wounded her so deeply, but the finality of the judgment. It was a dismissal of her mind, her thoughts, her very essence. The one part of her that was truly her own, her intellect, her inner world expressed through her words, was considered not just uninteresting, but an annoyance, a detail to be spared. She closed the file. She placed it back in the cabinet, exactly where she had found it. Her movements were calm, deliberate. No one would ever know she had seen it. She walked out of the study, her back straight, her head held high, but as she crossed the threshold, a door inside her closed. It did not slam. It closed softly, with a quiet, decisive click. The lock had turned. From that day forward, Eleanor was the perfect duchess. She was flawless. Her management of the household was impeccable. Her grace as a hostess was praised throughout the county. Her smile was always gentle, her manner always serene. She was present, and she was absent. She was there, and she was not there. She did not cease her duties. She simply ceased to invest them with any part of herself. She was a ghost in her own life, a beautiful, efficient automaton. The small, witty observations she used to make at dinner, the ones that had sometimes startled a brief, surprised smile from her husband, were no more. The shared glances of amusement over a particularly pompous guest, the quiet questions about his day, they vanished. She answered when spoken to, politely and concisely. She no longer initiated. She stopped playing the pianoforte in the evenings. She had often played after dinner, filling the vast silence of the drawing room with Bach or Scarlatti. Alistair had never commented on it, but he had found the music a pleasant backdrop to his reading of political papers. Now, the silence was absolute, a heavy, unadorned thing. The books she had once left strategically on tables in the library, silent recommendations for him, were now always neatly reshelved. The library itself, once her vibrant sanctuary, became just another room she passed through. Her true life retreated to a place he could not see, could not even conceive of. She began spending her afternoons in the derelict glass houses at the far end of the gardens, a place of broken panes and tangled, overgrown vines. With the help of one of the younger garden boys, she began the slow, arduous process of clearing them, of bringing order to the chaos. It was her own quiet work of restoration, a project for herself alone. Alistair at first noticed nothing. His life continued its orderly progression. The machine of his household ran perfectly. His duchess was a model of decorum. He was, in his detached way, content. But slowly, insidiously, a sense of wrongness began to creep into his awareness. It was not a specific event, but an accumulation of absences, a growing void he could not name. The house felt quieter. He had always valued quiet, but this was a different quality of silence. It was not peaceful. It was empty. He found himself looking up from his papers at dinner, expecting a comment from his wife, only to meet a placid, distant gaze. Her face was a beautiful, serene mask. He first put a name to the change one morning when he sat down at his desk in the study. For months, a small crystal vase on the corner of his desk had held a single, perfect flower. A rose, a sprig of lilac, a camellia, changed every day. He had never consciously acknowledged it, but its presence had been a small, silent note of grace in his sternly functional world. Now, the vase was empty, and it had been empty, he realized with a jolt, for weeks. It was a trivial thing, a flower, but its absence was like a missing tooth in a familiar smile. It unsettled him. He started to notice other things. The way she no longer looked at him when he spoke, her eyes fixed on some middle distance. The way her hands, once expressive when she talked of a book or an idea, now lay perfectly still in her lap. The way the staff, though still respectful, seemed to move around her with a kind of careful, protective sorrow. He tried to breach the invisible wall. "The planning for the autumn shoot is well underway," he remarked one evening, a conversational offering. "That is good to hear, Your Grace," she replied, her voice a placid stream. "Lord Ashworth is attending this year. You remember him, the man with the unfortunate laugh." He was trying to coax one of her dry, witty smiles. "I recall him," she said, and that was all. No smile, no shared joke. The offering lay untouched between them. He felt a growing sense of frustration, and beneath it, a nascent, unfamiliar anxiety. He had what he wanted, a quiet, biddable wife. Why did her perfect quiet now feel like a reproach? Why did her biddability feel like a dismissal? He had purchased a flawless porcelain doll, and he was beginning to hate the fact that it would not speak to him. He was a man who solved problems. He analyzed situations, identified the root cause, and implemented a solution. But here, there was no problem to identify. His wife was, by every external measure, perfect. There was nothing to fix. And yet, everything was broken. Section. The catalyst came, as it so often does, from an external source. Alistair traveled to London for a series of parliamentary sessions and meetings. His days were filled with the familiar cut and thrust of politics and finance, a world in which he was entirely comfortable and competent. On his final afternoon, he met with Mr. Harding in the solicitor's dusty, paper-crammed offices in Lincoln's Inn Fields. They were discussing a complex land swap agreement with a neighboring estate. The crux of the matter hinged on the productivity of a certain parcel of land, the very same lower valley farms that had once been prone to flooding. "The preliminary reports on the yield from the lower valley are extraordinary, Your Grace," Harding said, peering over his spectacles. "The tenant farmers are calling it a miracle." "My new steward is proving his worth," Alistair said with satisfaction. Harding made a small, non-committal noise. "Indeed, a fine man. Though the initial strategy, if I recall correctly, was not his." The solicitor paused, shuffling a sheaf of papers. "It was the Duchess who first proposed the revival of the water meadow system. She outlined it with remarkable clarity in a letter to me before the marriage, an astonishingly prescient piece of agricultural analysis. I found it invaluable." Alistair stared at his solicitor. He had a vague, hazy memory of Eleanor saying something about water meadows at her father's house. He had dismissed it as a girlish fancy, a piece of memorized text. He had certainly never connected it to the current success of the Valley Farms. "She wrote to you of such things?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of his surprise. Mr. Harding met his gaze directly. There was no overt judgment in the older man's eyes, but there was a weight, a coolness that felt like a verdict being delivered. "Your Grace," he said, his voice precise and deliberate. The Duchess's letters were models of clarity, intelligence, and foresight. I learned a great deal from them. I read every one twice. The words, so simple, so direct, struck Alistair with the force of a physical blow. I read every one twice. The solicitor's quiet statement was a direct, devastating echo of his own dismissive arrogance. Her letters are not worth reading. The two phrases hung in the air of the musty office, a perfect, damning counterpoint. The journey back to Blackwood Manor was a blur. Alistair sat in his carriage, oblivious to the passing landscape, his mind racing. He was a logical man, a man who dealt in facts and evidence. A series of disconnected facts were now, with terrifying speed, connecting themselves into a coherent and horrifying picture. The empty vase, the silent pianoforte, the perfectly polite, perfectly empty conversations, her sudden, inexplicable interest in a derelict glasshouse, the cool, sorrowful pity in Mrs. Gable's eyes, and Harding's words, a drumbeat in his skull. I read every one twice. He arrived at the manor as dusk was falling. He strode through the great hall, ignoring the butler's greeting, and went directly to his study. He did not hesitate. He went to the filing cabinet in the alcove, his heart hammering against his ribs with a strange, sick dread. He pulled out the file marked Vance Marriage Settlement. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. It took him a moment to find the letter from Harding, the one quoting Eleanor's words. And then he saw it. His own handwriting, his own arrogant, dismissive scrawl in the margin. "Harding, spare me the details." He sank into his chair, the file open on his desk. The truth, in that moment, was absolute and unbearable. He had not simply insulted her. He had not merely been dismissive. He had, with 5 careless words, committed an act of profound soul murder. He had taken the most vibrant, essential part of her, her mind, her voice, and declared it worthless. He had treated her not as a partner, not even as a person, but as an administrative inconvenience. He finally understood. He had married a rare and brilliant mind, a woman of depth and wit and perception, and he had been too blind, too arrogant, too utterly and completely stupid to see it. The silence that had unnerved him for months was not an absence of sound. It was the sound of her departure. She had not left his house. She had left him. He was living with her ghost. The realization brought not anger, but a deep, crushing wave of self-loathing. He had been a fool, a magnificent, high-handed, oblivious fool. Mr. Harding had been right. He had to find her. He had to... What? Apologize? The word seemed pathetically inadequate for the scale of his crime. He had to speak to her. He had to begin. He left the study and went in search of her. She was not in the library, nor the drawing room. A footman informed him that the Duchess spent most of her afternoons now in the old glasshouses. He had never been to the old glasshouses. They were a ruin, a relic from a more extravagant age. He walked through the gardens as the light faded, the familiar, manicured paths giving way to a wilder, more overgrown section of the grounds. He saw the skeletal frame of the structures ahead, panes of glass glinting in the twilight. He heard the faint sound of metal scraping against stone. He found her in the largest of the 3 structures. The air inside was cool and damp, smelling of earth and crushed leaves. Much of the glass was gone, but in one cleared section, Long trestle tables had been set up, covered in clay pots and seedlings. Eleanor was at the far end, her back to him, wearing a simple gardening apron over her dress. She was carefully, methodically scraping moss from the crevices of the old stone floor with a trowel. She did not seem to hear him approach. The quiet focus of her work was absolute. She was in her own world, a world she was building for herself, pane by pane, seedling by seedling. "Eleanor," he said. His voice sounded loud, intrusive in the quiet space. She straightened slowly, turning to face him. Her expression was unreadable, a calm, polite mask of inquiry. There was no surprise, no anger, nothing. "Your Grace, I did not expect you back from London so soon." He had rehearsed nothing. He had no plan. He walked towards her, holding the file from his study. He stopped a few feet away, the trestle tables between them. He did not make excuses. He did not prevaricate. He held up the file, opening it to the page with his damning note. "I found this," he said, his voice raw. "I read what I wrote." She looked at the file, then back at his face. Her own expression did not change, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not pain, but a deep, weary acknowledgement. She knew. Of course, she knew. "I was wrong," he said. The words felt small, absurdly insufficient. He pushed on, forcing himself to articulate the full scope of his failure. "I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. I saw our marriage as a transaction, a duty to be performed. I saw you as a component of that transaction. I did not see you. I did not see you at all." He took a breath, the confession costing him more than any political debate or financial negotiation ever had. The woman who wrote those letters to Harding, the woman who understood Water Meadows. I never even looked for her, and I am profoundly sorry for the injury I have caused you. He did not ask for forgiveness. He knew he had no right to it. He simply stated the truth of his failure. He stood there, the Duke of Blackwood, a man who had never had to apologize for anything in his life, utterly humbled before the wife he had so thoroughly misjudged. Eleanor listened, her gaze steady. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of the wind sighing through the broken panes of glass. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, devoid of accusation. "And what do you expect to happen now, Your Grace?" she asked. It was not a challenge. It was a genuine question. "I expect nothing," he said honestly. "I deserve nothing, but I intend to change." The next morning, a message was dispatched to London, canceling His Grace's planned trip to a diplomatic conference in Vienna. An urgent matter of estate business, his secretary wrote, required his presence at Blackwood. That same morning, Alistair summoned his new estate steward and his senior land managers to the lower valley. He walked them through the water meadows, and in front of them all, he laid out the plan for their expansion and improvement. "This entire strategy," he announced, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air, "was conceived and designed by Her Grace, the Duchess. Her insights into land management are proving to be one of this estate's greatest assets. You will consult with her directly on all future phases of this project." The steward and managers exchanged glances of astonishment. The Duke had never, in living memory, credited anyone but himself with a successful idea. To publicly cede such authority to his wife, a woman they had all assumed was merely decorative, was a seismic shift in the established order of things. It was a public declaration of respect, a clear and decisive action of atonement. Eleanor heard of it, as he knew she would, through the household grapevine. She made no comment. When he saw her at dinner that evening, Her expression was as serene and distant as ever. The wall between them remained. He had laid a single stone of contrition at its base, but the wall itself stood tall and impenetrable. She did not immediately capitulate. Her trust was not a trinket to be won back with a single grand gesture. It was a delicate, living thing that he had crushed through carelessness, and it would not be revived easily. Her new terms were unspoken, but he understood them perfectly. Show me. Prove that this was not a fleeting remorse, but a fundamental transformation. And so Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, began the slow, uncertain, and deeply unfamiliar process of courting his own wife. He started in the library. He saw the book of poetry by Donne she had been reading, and he read it himself, struggling through the metaphysical conceits until he found passages of breathtaking beauty that he thought she might have loved. He left it on the table, open to one such page. The next day, the book was gone, re-shelved, but he thought perhaps he was only imagining it, that the bookmark had been moved. He began to ask her opinion on matters far beyond the household. He brought her estate reports, treasury statements, letters from his political allies. At first, she was reticent, her answers brief and non-committal. But he persisted, not accepting her polite deflections. He would press her. "No, Eleanor, I want to know what you truly think. Would you be so bold in a letter to Mr. Harding?" The first time he said that, he saw a flicker of her old fire in her eyes, a spark of the woman who had been buried alive. "In a letter to Mr. Harding," she had replied, her voice cool and level. "I would have advised that your position on the Corn Laws is sentimental, economically unsound, and will ultimately prove to be a political liability." He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply nodded. "Thank you," he said. "Explain to me why." And she did. For the first time in their marriage, they had a true conversation, a debate of minds. It was rigorous, it was challenging, and it was the most exhilarating hour he had ever spent. He started to join her in the glass house. He did not offer clumsy help. He watched. He learned. He asked the names of the strange, exotic seedlings she was nurturing back to life. He learned the difference between a cutting and a root division. He brought her a rare book on orchid cultivation he had sourced from a bookseller in London. He did not give it to her as a gift. He left it on a workbench with a note. "I thought this might be of interest." The next day, she thanked him. It was a small thing, but it felt like a monumental victory. He began to write her letters. Even though they lived in the same house, he would write to her at night, short notes left on her dressing table. They were not florid love letters. He was not a poet. They were observations about his day, questions about hers, thoughts prompted by a book he was reading. They were clumsy, formal attempts at connection. He was trying to speak to her in the language he had once scorned, the language she valued most. He was showing her that her words, her thoughts on paper, were now something he craved. The rebuilding was a slow, quiet process, a matter of accumulated moments, not grand pronouncements. It was the way he now waited for her to speak first at dinner, the way he brought her a shawl when she worked late in the glasshouse, the way he began to read aloud to her in the evenings, not from political journals but from novels and poetry, filling the silence that he had created with words again. The external test of his transformation came during the annual county dinner, hosted that year at Blackwood Manor. The gathering included Lord Ashworth, a bluff, hearty neighbor whose family had been rivals of the Blackwoods for generations. Ashworth, having heard of the Duke's new interest in agricultural fancies, saw an opportunity for mockery. Heard you've turned your best pasture into a swamp, Blackwood, he boomed across the dinner table, loud enough for everyone to hear. At the behest of the Duchess, no less. Taking farming advice from a woman now, are we? What's next? Getting her opinion on horseflesh. The table fell silent. It was a direct, public challenge to Alistair's authority and a deep insult to Eleanor. The Alistair of 6 months ago would have met the jibe with a cold, cutting remark that would have flayed Ashworth alive. But this was a different man. He placed his fork down deliberately and looked at Ashworth, his gaze level and calm. "Lord Ashworth," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "My wife's intellect is the single greatest asset this estate has acquired in a century. Her plan for the water meadows has already doubled the yield of the lower valley farms and will enrich this county for generations to come. If your own estate had the benefit of such a mind, you might not be forced to sell off your timber every second year to cover your gambling debts." He then turned to Eleanor, seated beside him, and gave her a small, private smile. "As for horseflesh," he continued, his eyes still on her, "I find her judgment on that, as on all things, to be impeccable." It was a total, devastating defense. He had not only defended her, he had championed her. He had publicly declared her his partner, his equal, his superior in matters of intellect. Eleanor looked at him, and for the first time in many, many months, her smile reached her eyes. The wall did not crumble, but a gate had just swung open. Later that night, after the last guest had departed, he found her in the library. She was standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit gardens. "Thank you," she said softly, without turning around, "for what you did tonight." "It was only the truth," he replied, coming to stand beside her. He did not touch her. He just stood with her, sharing the silence, but it was a different silence now. It was full, not empty. It was a silence of companionship. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low, "when I married you, I saw it as a duty to my name, to my lineage, an obligation to be fulfilled. I was wrong. The only duty I feel now is the duty of a man who has been given a gift he did not deserve, and who must spend the rest of his life striving to be worthy of it." He finally turned to face her, his heart in his eyes. "The duty has become a devotion. I love you, not the Duchess of Blackwood. I love Eleanor Vance, the woman who reads Virgil and understands soil and writes letters that can change the world. The woman I was too great a fool to see." She finally turned her full gaze on him. The mask was gone. He saw the woman he had glimpsed in her letters, the woman he had heard in her arguments, the woman he had fallen, belatedly but completely, in love with. "Alistair," she said, and the use of his given name was an absolution. "I believe it is time you showed me the plans for the new West Wing." A year later, the glass house was a marvel, a lush, thriving world of green under shimmering panes of restored glass. The water meadows were the talk of the agricultural societies, and Blackwood Manor, once a silent, cavernous house, was filled with the sounds of true life, conversation, laughter, and the music of the pianoforte, which now played every evening. Eleanor was seated in the library, a stack of books beside her, a contented roundness to her figure beneath her gown. Alistair sat opposite her, reading not a political treatise, but a novel she had recommended. Theirs was a partnership, a quiet, formidable union of two minds that had, against all odds, found a way to speak the same language. The house was no longer just a seat of power, it was a home. And soon, its nursery would no longer be silent. Mr. Harding was visiting to finalize the paperwork on the land swap agreement, the very one that had, in its own way, begun all of this. He sat in the Duke's study, the business concluded, sharing a glass of port with his employer. On the corner of the Duke's desk, the crystal vase was once again occupied, today holding a rare, star-shaped orchid from the glasshouse. Beside it lay a small stack of letters, tied with a ribbon. A brief trip to her sister's, Alistair explained, noticing Harding's glance. He picked up the top letter, his expression softening as he looked at the familiar script. He opened it, his eyes scanning the page with an open, unreserved pleasure. He chuckled softly at one passage. "Listen to this, Harding," he said. And he read aloud a paragraph of witty, incisive social commentary about their country neighbors that was so perfectly observed, so elegantly phrased, that the solicitor found himself smiling in pure admiration. Alistair carefully refolded the letter and placed it back on the stack. He looked across the desk at the man who had, with a few carefully chosen words, lit the fuse of his awakening. "Her letters, Harding," the Duke said, his voice filled with a quiet, profound contentment. "They are worth a great deal more than a second reading. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for listening." The Duke made a terrible mistake, but he did everything in his power to atone for it. Tell me in the comments, if you were the Duchess, what one condition would you have added for him to win back your trust? I love reading your ideas. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more tales of historical romance. Your support means the world. Our next story is about a governess with a secret, a widowed earl haunted by his past, and a locked nursery that holds the key to both of their futures. They arrive here, in this small corner of the world, whenever they are ready.